Hi, I'm Eric Shanks. I'm one of the Chicago VMUG leaders here at the Chicago VMUG Conference. I also run a blog called theithollow.com, and I wanted to go over some VMware Site Recovery Manager gotchas that I see in the field. I do quite a bit of disaster recovery planning for customers, and these are some of the things that I've seen in the past and just wanted to get them out there. Just to start, one of the things that happens a lot is you'll see a customer start their disaster recovery testing with SRM, and they'll fail over, and it'll take a very long time to fail over, and they wonder why. So many times they'll get errors when they do their failovers, and it's simply because VMware Tools is not running on the VMs. So when that happens, Site Recovery Manager, the only way it can tell if the VMs are powered on and working is it connects to VMware Tools. If VMware Tools is not running, it can't tell that it's working, so it has to wait for a timeout period to happen, and that could be 600 seconds or higher if they've changed it. So this is one of the things to check on. VMware Tools should be installed on all the VMs that you care about. If you don't have VMware Tools on a VM for a specific reason, when you do your failovers, there's a way that you can uncheck wait for VMware Tools on power on. Another thing that happens is non-replicated disks. For instance, a VM has a CD-ROM drive attached to it. It might be an ISO on a data store. That ISO probably doesn't exist in the same data store on the DR side and won't be able to connect to the VM. So when you try to fail over, you'll get an error because that disk doesn't exist. So it's always a good idea to check your CD-ROMs, make sure things aren't attached. Same thing goes for hard drives. Sometimes you've got a hard disk that you don't want to replicate to the DR site to save bandwidth. So there's an option when you do the failover to detach that drive so that you don't get errors when you try to fail over a virtual machine that doesn't have a drive at the DR site. Replication groups. If you are using, first off, array-based replication, everything that's in the LUN that you're failing over needs to all fail over. I have seen a customer recently that had non-production stuff on their LUN, wanted to fail over some of the VMs, and they failed it over, and it took down the VMs that they were hoping to stay in production. That can't happen. You have to fail everything over that's on everything that's on a LUN if you're doing array-based replication for SRM. Also, another thing to be conscious of is database files. So many people split their database files onto different disks. So you've got your data on one disk and your logs on another disk. Both of those need to fail over at the same time, and they need to be replicated together. So you wouldn't want to fail over your SQL server and have the data drive that's been replicated 10 minutes ago and the logs that were replicated 15 minutes ago. You're going to have an inconsistent database, which is going to be a problem. Some of the planning that needs to be involved here is the IP scheme. This typically takes the longest amount of time in the planning stages, from my experience. How do you want to fail your VMs over, and how will you connect to the VMs when they're at the DR site? There's several options here. Cisco OTV is one method where you can have basically a layer 2 VPN on both sides, so when you fail VM over from production to DR, that VM maintains the same IP address, and it can still be connected the same way as it has before. You can also do things like a layer 2 VPN tunnel, which comes with its own caveats, like bum traffic going across your WAN. So you'd have floods on the switches that would go across the WAN, which may eat up your bandwidth and it may not be desirable. Or lastly, you can do re-IP of the virtual machines. So for each virtual machine, when you do the configuration, you can say at the production site, I want IP address 1.1.1.1, and the DR site, I want 2.2.2.2. So you can do that for each individual VM, which can be a little tedious, or you can do all of them in mass by using basically an Excel template that VMware has provided that allows you to enter all the VM names, IP addresses at both sites, and then you can import that and it'll set that up for you. Replication. This may be less of an issue for a large enterprise customer because typically they have a lot of bandwidth. But for a small to medium business, this may be more of an issue. Replication of block level data. If you're doing array-based replication, this can be an issue if you're doing things like defrag. So if you're doing a defrag on a Windows VM, you haven't changed any data, but you moved it all around. So the defrag means all the blocks have changed, which means you're replicating the entire VM over again, which may not be what you want to do. Reindexing of like a database server is another thing that would do basically the same thing. So if you've got a database administrator that reindexes his database on a nightly basis, again, you're not really changing any of your data, but the blocks are all being moved around, meaning you have to replicate again, which could give you a spike in your bandwidth, or in the usage of your bandwidth at that point. You may try other methods with these things, like you could do SQL log shipping or something like that, or another high availability method like SQL always on or something like that. Snapshots. If you snapshot your VM, the snapshot probably lives exactly where the VM lives. So if the snapshot is growing, that's more things you're replicating to the DR site. So just be careful with snapshots and be aware that all of that data is replicating as well. And your bandwidth. I've seen some smaller customers who are trying to save money on their disaster recovery have used asynchronous bandwidth, like a DSL connection. So they may have 50 megs down, which is just fine. They can replicate their data to the DR site. But when they try to go back to the production site, they all of a sudden find out they've only got a fraction of the bandwidth that they had, which can cause a problem with their failback scenario, which is something that should be planned for. DR prep. So SRM makes things very easy to fail over, but it doesn't fail everything over. What happens when you fail over to the DR site and all of a sudden something that was working in the production site isn't, you need to spin up a new VM? Do you have a template at the DR site ready to go? Can you build the VM in a matter of minutes like you're normally used to? Or do you have to go and install Windows and update patches and all that stuff when you're at the DR site? Another thing is, do you have printers, faxes, phones at the DR site? Because you're not going to fail many of those over. Hopefully you don't need faxes at all, and that takes care of itself. And lastly, the preparation for your disaster event. SRM has a run book built into it that shows you every step that's going to happen to fail your servers over from the production site to the DR site. It does not say anything about how your users are going to get notified that there was a disaster. Maybe they telecommute. They have no idea that things have changed. There's maybe a different login method for them. So a phone tree is always a good idea. Typically, it can be done from the top level. Whoever's declared the disaster calls a certain number of people. They call whoever's in their team, and then everyone knows that there's been a disaster at the office, and there's a new method to log in. Also, people aren't going to remember a separate set of instructions if they have to log in a different manner. One thing that's been done in the past is we had a website that was up all the time. It was called disaster.companyname.com, and if you went there at any given time, it would probably say, there's nothing to see here, move along. But in the event of a disaster, one of the things in the IT runbook was flip this switch to a different directory in the web directories, and it would come up with a list of, here's how you log in and all of your instructions. So when managers were calling their employees and saying, hey, there was a disaster, go to the disaster website here, and that's all they would have to say or remember. And after that, everything was listed for the users. So I hope that this was useful, and if you hadn't thought about some of these things for SRM, give them a think.